A waiter gave me a black box, and what I found inside destroyed my marriage. At least, that's what I believed that night. Daniel, are you really going to wear that old watch again? My wife asked with a laugh while three strangers at the next table listened. Honey, that thing belongs in a museum. Everyone chuckled. I forced a smile. A few minutes later, she added, sometimes I think you're the only man in Texas who still worries about the price of dessert. More laughter. I looked down at my plate and said nothing. I had spent 34 years building a life with that woman, and somehow, in a crowded restaurant overlooking Lake Travis, I felt smaller than I had in years. What I didn't know was that before the night ended, a stranger would place something in my hand. What I didn't know was that the person I trusted most had been hiding a truth so large it would split my life into two halves. The life before the box, and the life after it. What happened next changed my family, my future, and everything I thought I knew about love. If this story speaks to your heart, or if it reminds you of someone you've known, consider liking and subscribing, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And if you're listening tonight, leave a comment telling me your city, your country, and your local time. I always find comfort knowing where people are listening from. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 67 years old. I live in Austin, Texas. And this is the story of the evening that shattered an illusion I didn't even know I was living inside. The lesson I learned from it took me 34 years to understand, so stay with me until the end. And now let me tell you where it all began. It was late September. One of those warm Texas evenings when the sun hangs low over the water and turns everything gold. Rebecca and I were celebrating our 34th wedding anniversary at a lakeside restaurant we'd visited for years. The place wasn't fancy by Austin standards, but it had history. We had celebrated birthdays there, promotions, Emily's college acceptance, even our retirement dinner after I sold my company 8 years earlier. The hostess recognized us. The manager waved from across the room. For everyone looking in, we were one of those couples who had made it, one of those marriages people admired. Rebecca looked elegant that night. She always did. Her silver earrings caught the sunset whenever she turned her head. The waiter had barely taken our order before she started correcting me. Daniel, you don't need to ask about the specials every single time. She laughed softly. You're retired, not preparing a business report. The couple beside us smiled politely. I smiled too. Old habits, I said. Some habits should stay in the past. She took a sip of wine. The words weren't cruel enough to start an argument. That was Rebecca's gift. She had learned how to make a man feel foolish without ever raising her voice. The strange thing was that 10 years earlier I would have defended her. I would have told myself she was joking. I would have blamed my own sensitivity. But lately something had changed. The comments came more often. The little corrections, the tiny cuts, never deep enough to leave a scar. Just enough to remind me where I stood. As dinner continued, she spent more time looking at her phone than talking to me. Every few minutes the screen lit up. She'd glance down, type something quickly, then lock it again. Everything okay? I asked. Work stuff. Her answer came too fast. On an anniversary dinner? She smiled. The world doesn't stop because we're eating salmon. I nodded. The conversation died. A breeze drifted through the open patio doors carrying the smell of water and cedar. Somewhere outside, a boat horn echoed across the lake. I looked at Rebecca. She was staring at her phone again. For a brief second I felt like a guest at my own anniversary dinner. Then, something happened. Rebecca excused herself to the restroom. I watched her disappear down the hallway near the bar. A few moments later, a young waiter approached my table. He wasn't ours. I'd never seen him before. Maybe 26, 27, nervous eyes, baseball cap tucked under one arm. He stopped beside me. Mr. Mercer? I frowned. Yes? He glanced over his shoulder. Can I ask you something? Sure. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. Are you here with Rebecca Mercer? The question felt strange. I am. His jaw tightened. For a second it looked like he might change his mind. Then he reached into the pocket of his apron and pulled out a small black box. It was no larger than a paperback book. Matte black. No markings. No label. Nothing. My stomach tightened immediately. What is that? I asked. He placed it gently beside my water glass. Please take it. Why? He looked toward the hallway again. Because you need to see what's inside. Every instinct in my body told me something was wrong. Who are you? My name's Tyler. His eyes met mine. There was fear in them. Real fear. Listen carefully. Don't open it here. Don't let your wife see it. I stared at him. What's inside? I can't explain right now. Then explain enough. He swallowed hard. Just promise me you'll wait until tonight. Before I could ask another question, I heard footsteps approaching. Rebecca was returning. Tyler stepped backward immediately. Wait, I said. Tyler. But he was already walking away. Not running, not panicking. Just disappearing into the crowd with the urgency of someone who desperately wanted to be somewhere else. Rebecca sat down across from me. Who was that? She asked. I looked at the black box, then at her. Something inside me said not to answer honestly. Wrong table, I replied. She shrugged and reached for her wine. The box sat beside me for the rest of dinner. Silent, heavy, impossible to ignore. Several times I caught myself staring at it. Rebecca noticed. What is that? She asked eventually. My pulse quickened. Nothing important. For the first time all evening, her eyes narrowed. Not dramatically, just enough. Since when do you keep secrets? I managed a small laugh. Since about 10 minutes ago. She didn't smile back. The ride home felt longer than usual. The black box rested inside the trunk of my SUV. Every red light seemed to last forever. Every mile felt heavier than the last. Beside me, Rebecca talked about Emily's upcoming birthday dinner in Dallas. I barely heard a word. My thoughts kept drifting back to Tyler's face. The fear in his eyes. The warning in his voice. Don't let your wife see it. By the time we pulled into our driveway, the sky had turned dark. Rebecca headed inside first. I remained in the garage for a moment longer, staring at the trunk. The old wedding watch felt unusually heavy on my wrist. Somewhere deep inside me, a feeling I couldn't explain began to grow. Not anger, not fear, something colder, something older. The feeling a man gets when he finally notices a crack in a wall he's trusted for years. I opened the trunk slowly and looked down at the black box. And for the first time that night, I realized there was only one question that truly mattered. How did a complete stranger know something about my marriage that I didn't? I stood in the garage for what felt like a long time after Rebecca went inside. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the engine cooling beneath the hood of my SUV. The black box sat in the trunk, untouched. I should have opened it right then. Part of me wanted to. Another part was afraid that once I knew the truth, whatever that truth was, I would never be able to return to the life I had been living. I closed the trunk and walked into the house. Rebecca was already upstairs. I could hear the television from our bedroom. For a moment, everything looked normal. The framed family photographs along the hallway. The grandfather clock near the staircase. The faded map of Alaska hanging beside my study door. That map always stopped me. 20 years earlier, Rebecca and I had promised ourselves we would take that trip after retirement. We used to sit at the kitchen table with travel brochures spread between our coffee mugs. One day, she would say, one day we will stand on a glacier together. I believed her. Looking back, I realize how many promises in life begin sincerely and slowly fade into something neither person recognizes. I made myself a cup of coffee even though it was nearly 10 o'clock at night. Old habits. When stress found me, coffee usually followed. I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the dark window above the sink. My reflection stared back. Older than I remembered, more tired than I wanted to admit. The strange thing about emotional pain is that it rarely begins with one event. People think hearts break in a single moment. Mine did not. Mine cracked a little at a time over many years. Tiny fractures, barely noticeable at first. Rebecca had not always been distant. When we met, she was 27 and working at a small accounting office in downtown Austin. I was 33 and trying to keep a struggling construction supply business alive. We were both exhausted all the time. We were both broke. We were both chasing a future we could not yet see. You know you work too much, she told me on our third date. That is because somebody has to pay for dinner. She laughed. I can pay for my own dinner. I remember falling in love with that laugh. Back then, she made me feel lighter, stronger, like life was something we were building together. Years later, when Emily was born, Rebecca stayed awake for 2 straight nights because our daughter would not stop crying. I can still picture her walking through the hallway at 3 in the morning with Emily resting against her shoulder. Go back to sleep, she whispered when she caught me watching. You have work tomorrow. Those memories were real. That is what made everything hurt so much. If Rebecca had been cruel from the beginning, none of this would have mattered. The problem was that she had once been my safest place. I carried my coffee into the living room and sat in the recliner beside the window. Across from me sat Rebecca's reading chair. It faced the backyard. A knitted blanket still rested across one arm. The sight of it brought back another memory. About 12 years ago, after I sold my company, we hosted a barbecue for friends. Everyone gathered on the patio. Music played. Emily was home from college. Rebecca spent most of the evening talking with guests while I grilled burgers. At one point, someone asked how the business had become successful. Before I could answer, Rebecca smiled and said, "The company survived because I stopped Daniel from making half his terrible decisions." Everyone laughed, including me. It sounded harmless. Maybe it was. But afterward, driving home, I remember feeling oddly small. "That bothered you, did it not?" she asked. "Not really." "Good," she said, because it was true. I told myself she was joking. I always told myself that. Another memory surfaced, 5 years ago at a neighborhood Christmas party. Someone complimented the new truck I had purchased. Before I could respond, Rebecca rolled her eyes and said, "Give him 10 minutes and he will explain every detail you never wanted to know." The room laughed. Again, tiny moments, tiny cuts. Never enough to start a fight. Never enough to justify hurt feelings, but enough to leave a mark. The clock on the wall read 10:47 p.m. Upstairs, I heard footsteps crossing the bedroom floor. Then silence. I thought about Tyler. I thought about the fear in his voice. Most of all, I thought about the question that had followed me home. Why would a complete stranger risk approaching me? People do not insert themselves into other people's marriages without a reason. I looked toward the staircase. Rebecca had no idea what sat in my garage. She had no idea how close I was to opening it. Or maybe she did. The thought appeared suddenly and refused to leave. For the first time that night, I remembered something unusual from dinner. When Tyler had approached our table, he had not looked at me first. He had looked toward the hallway where Rebecca had disappeared, as if he was making sure she was gone, as if she was the reason he was there at all. A chill moved through me. I set my coffee cup down beside the chair and stared into the darkness beyond the window. The house felt different now. Not dangerous, not unfamiliar, just uncertain. Like a photograph that looked normal until you noticed something standing in the background. Something that had always been there, waiting to be seen. And as the silence settled around me, I realized the pain I was carrying tonight did not begin at that restaurant. It had been growing quietly for years, which meant whatever waited inside that black box might not be the beginning of my story. It might be the explanation. The house was asleep when I finally stood up from the recliner. The clock read 11:38 p.m. The kitchen light cast a pale reflection across the hardwood floor, and for a moment I simply listened. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic somewhere beyond our neighborhood, the quiet breathing of a life that looked perfectly normal from the outside. I walked into the garage and opened the trunk again. The black box was still there, waiting. I carried it inside and set it on the dining room table. My hands rested on either side of it. Strange how an ordinary object can feel heavier than a lifetime. Before opening it, I found myself looking around the room. The dining table had hosted 30 years of birthdays, Thanksgiving dinners, graduation celebrations, and family arguments that always seemed small the next morning. Above the fireplace hung a photograph of Emily at 16, smiling beside the old fishing boat I had spent 2 summers restoring. Rebecca had complained about that boat constantly. "You spent more time with that thing than with me," she used to say. Back then I thought she was teasing. Now I was not so sure. I reached for the lid. Then I stopped. Something else had surfaced in my memory. A conversation from 6 months earlier. Emily had invited us to Dallas for dinner. Nathan had grilled steaks in the backyard while Rebecca and Emily sat near the patio fire pit. At one point I walked outside carrying drinks and heard Rebecca speaking before she noticed me. "Your father still thinks everything belongs to him." Emily looked uncomfortable. "Mom, that is not fair." Rebecca shrugged. "You will understand one day." The conversation ended the moment I appeared. I remember brushing it off. Families say strange things. That is what I told myself. But now, sitting alone with that box, I realized how often I had ignored things simply because I did not want to face them. My phone buzzed suddenly. The sound startled me. A text message from Rebecca upstairs. "Are you coming to bed?" I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I typed back. In a little while, her reply came almost immediately. "Do not stay up too late. We have church tomorrow." I set the phone aside. There was something oddly distant about the exchange. Two people living under the same roof. Two people speaking through glowing screens. The box remained between my hands. Yet before I opened it, another memory arrived. This one sharper, more painful. About 3 years earlier, shortly after I finalized the family trust with my attorney, Rebecca had insisted on reviewing the paperwork. We sat in my study together. She flipped through pages while I explained how everything would eventually pass to Emily and any future grandchildren. "Why does your attorney make this so complicated?" she asked. "Because trusts are supposed to be complicated. Seems unnecessary." I laughed. "You always hated paperwork." Her eyes lingered on one section longer than the others. "So nobody can change anything without your approval?" "That is the idea." She closed the folder. "Interesting. At the time it meant nothing to me. Tonight it felt different." The memory stayed with me because of the way she said that last word. Interesting. Not reassuring, not relieved, just interested. My stomach tightened. Another memory followed. 2 months ago, Rebecca asking questions about accounts she had never cared about before. Retirement funds, property records, investment statements. I had even joked about it. Planning to run for accountant of the year? She smiled. Maybe I am finally becoming responsible. We both laughed. Yet now those questions echoed inside my head with a different meaning. The pieces were not fitting together yet, but they were moving, slowly, like storm clouds gathering over a lake. Upstairs, I heard a floorboard creak. Rebecca was still awake. For reasons I could not explain, I suddenly slipped the box beneath the table. Instinct. Nothing more. A minute later, she appeared at the kitchen doorway wearing a robe. "There you are." She smiled. "I was wondering if you got lost." "Just thinking." She stepped closer. "About what?" "Life." That earned a small laugh. "Well, do not think too hard. It never helps." She poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then her eyes drifted toward the dining table. "You have been spending a lot of time down here tonight. Could not sleep. You have looked distracted ever since dinner." Her voice remained casual. Too casual. "Everything all right?" "Of course." "Good," she nodded. "Because sometimes I worry you carry things longer than you should." The sentence sounded caring. Yet something beneath it felt different. Almost like a warning. She finished her water and set down the glass. "Come upstairs soon." "I will." She smiled and walked away. I listened to her footsteps fade. Then I waited another full minute before pulling the box back onto the table. My pulse was faster now. Not because I knew anything, because I was beginning to suspect something. Rebecca had asked more questions lately. About money, about control, about documents, about things she once ignored completely. And somehow, without realizing it, I had started keeping score. The frightening part was not the possibility that she had secrets. The frightening part was realizing how many signs I had already collected. Slowly, carefully, I placed my fingers on the lid again. Whatever waited inside this box, I knew one thing now. Tonight was not creating a problem. Tonight was exposing one. And somewhere in the middle of all those old conversations, all those strange questions, and all those moments I chose not to examine too closely, someone had touched something they never should have touched. Something that sat at the very center of my life. Something worth hiding. Something worth lying about. And perhaps, something worth destroying a marriage to obtain. For several seconds I sat motionless, staring at the box in front of me. The house was silent again. Rebecca had gone upstairs. The hallway light cast a faint glow across the dining room floor. Somewhere outside, a sprinkler clicked rhythmically in a neighbor's yard. Ordinary sounds, ordinary moments. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. I finally lifted the lid. Inside were 4 items. A small flash drive, an older model cell phone, a thin notebook with a black cover, and a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in careful block letters. Daniel Mercer. My throat tightened. Whoever prepared this had not thrown random things together. This had been assembled deliberately, patiently. I picked up the envelope first. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The message was short. "If you are reading this, It means you were finally told the truth. Start with the notebook, then call the number on the last page. Do not confront anyone until you understand everything. I read it twice, then a third time. The handwriting meant nothing to me. No signature, no explanation. I opened the notebook. Most of the pages contained dates, names, locations, business meetings, hotel lobbies, restaurants, financial references. At first, the entries seemed disconnected. Then I recognized one name immediately: Richard Hale. The name hit me like a cold gust of wind. Richard was a real estate investor from Dallas. Rebecca had mentioned him several times over the past few years. According to her, he was involved in charity projects and commercial developments throughout Texas. I remembered meeting him once at a fundraising dinner. He had shaken my hand firmly and smiled too much. "I have heard a lot about you, Daniel," he had said. "Rebecca speaks highly of you." Back then I thought nothing of it. Now his name appeared repeatedly throughout the notebook, page after page, month after month. My stomach twisted. I reached for the cell phone. The battery still had a charge. When the screen illuminated, dozens of saved files appeared. Messages, photographs, documents. I did not open any of them yet. Something told me to slow down, to understand before reacting. That was when I turned to the final page of the notebook. A phone number was written beneath a simple instruction: call after midnight. I glanced at the clock. 12:07 a.m. The number stared back at me. I hesitated only briefly before dialing. The line rang once, twice. Then a calm voice answered. "I wondered when you would call." I sat upright. "Who is this?" "My name is Robert Gaines." The name sounded familiar. "Do I know you?" A soft chuckle came through the receiver. "Not personally, but I knew your father." My pulse quickened. My father had been dead for nearly 20 years. "How?" "We served together in Vietnam." I stared into the darkness beyond the dining room window. "You knew my father?" "Very well." Silence settled between us for a moment. Then he continued. "Daniel, before we discuss anything else, I need to ask a question. Did you receive the notebook?" "Yes." "Good. Then I suspect you are beginning to see the pattern." "I do not even know what pattern I am looking at." "That is understandable." His voice remained steady, measured, the voice of a man accustomed to difficult conversations. "Tell me something. Have you ever met Richard Hale?" "Once." "And Rebecca?" The question felt strange. "She is my wife." Another pause. Longer this time. "Daniel, I am afraid that answer may be more complicated than it appears." I felt my grip tighten around the phone. "What exactly is this?" "A warning." "From who?" "From people who have spent years watching things they should not have ignored." I leaned back slowly. Every instinct told me to hang up. Yet something about the man's voice kept me listening. There was no excitement in it. No drama. Just certainty. "Why are you involved?" I asked. Robert exhaled quietly. "Because a friend asked me to be." "Who?" "A man named Thomas Brooks." The name meant nothing to me. "Should it?" "It will." He paused again. Thomas was Tyler's father. The room suddenly felt smaller. Tyler, the waiter, the young man who handed me the box. What does his father have to do with any of this? "Thomas worked as a financial analyst for nearly 30 years, Robert replied. "He was one of the most honest men I ever met. And he discovered something he could not ignore." I felt a chill move through me. Robert continued. "For years, he documented financial irregularities connected to several business ventures. Names kept appearing: partnerships, property transfers, hidden transactions. Eventually, one name appeared more often than all the others. I already knew the answer before he said it. Richard Hale. Yes. The word landed heavily. Robert continued carefully. Thomas gathered evidence. He intended to report everything formally, but before he could finish, his health declined. I closed my eyes. So he gave everything to his son? No. Robert's answer surprised me. He gave everything to me. Silence filled the line. Then Robert added something that made my blood run cold. And before he passed away, he specifically told me that if anything ever happened involving your family, you deserve to know the truth. I sat perfectly still. My family? Yes. Why would he say that? Robert sighed. Because your name appeared in his files years ago. The words seemed to echo through the room. My name? Years ago. Before I could ask another question, Robert spoke again. Daniel, I need you to understand something important. The people involved in this situation believe they understand exactly who you are. They believe they know your finances, your retirement, your family trust, your future. My heart pounded. And his answer came quietly. They do not. I stared at the photographs on the wall, the old family pictures, the smiling faces, the life I thought I understood. What are you telling me? I whispered. Robert's voice remained calm, almost sympathetic. I am telling you that somebody made a very serious mistake. They looked at a retired man living quietly in Austin and assumed he was no longer paying attention. They assumed he was weak. They assumed he was finished. He paused. Daniel. They never bothered to learn who they were really dealing with. I remained at the dining room table long after the call ended. The screen of my phone had gone dark, yet Robert's final words continued to echo through my mind. They never bothered to learn who they were really dealing with. The strange thing was that I was not entirely sure I knew anymore. At 67, most people in my life saw a retired man, a husband, a father, a grandfather someday, hopefully. The man who watered his lawn every Tuesday and bought the same coffee beans every week. That was the version of me everyone recognized. It was the version I had allowed them to see. I looked down at my hands resting on the table. They were older now, the knuckles thicker, the skin rougher, but those hands had once built something from nothing. Years ago, before Austin became what it is today, before technology companies and luxury towers changed the skyline, I spent every day driving dusty roads across central Texas looking for opportunities. I remembered sleeping 4 hours a night. I remembered carrying lumber in 100-degree heat. I remembered signing payroll checks before paying myself. Nobody handed me anything. Not a single thing. Yet somewhere along the way, people stopped seeing the builder and started seeing the retired man, including, perhaps, my own family. The thought stayed with me as I opened the notebook again. This time, I paid closer attention to the dates. Some stretched back nearly 4 years. 4 years. That realization unsettled me more than anything else. Whatever the situation was, it had not appeared overnight. It had been growing quietly while birthdays were celebrated, holidays were shared, and family photographs were taken. I picked up the flash drive but did not insert it into my computer yet. Robert's advice echoed in my head. Understand everything before reacting. Outside, the first hints of rain began tapping softly against the windows. The sound reminded me of another rainy night many years earlier. Emily had been 12. Rebecca was worried about money. My company was expanding faster than expected, and cash flow was tight. I still remember her sitting across from me at the kitchen table. What if it all falls apart? She asked. Then I will build it again. She smiled. You always say that. Because it is true. Back then she believed in me. Or at least I thought she did. The memory left a hollow feeling in my chest. Around 1 in the morning, I finally carried the notebook into my study. The room smelled faintly of old books and cedar shelves. On one wall, hung photographs from different chapters of my life, company award ceremonies, charity projects, community events. Most people never paid attention to those pictures. Rebecca rarely did. Emily sometimes asked questions when she was younger. Dad, who is that man standing next to you? She once asked while pointing at a photograph from 15 years ago. Just an old governor. Her eyes widened. You knew the governor? I laughed. Knowing someone and taking a photograph with them are two different things. Yet the truth was more complicated. Over 40 years in business, I had met mayors, judges, legislators, investors, military officers, and community leaders. Not because I chased power, because construction projects touched every part of a growing city. Relationships formed naturally, trust formed slowly. I never considered any of it important. Until now. My eyes drifted toward a framed certificate hanging beside the bookshelf. Austin Community Development Council, Lifetime Recognition Award. Rebecca had wanted to put it in storage years ago. Nobody cares about old plaques, she said. Maybe she was right. Yet looking at it tonight, I wondered how many pieces of my life had quietly disappeared from the way people saw me. The phone rang suddenly. The sound startled me. I glanced at the screen. Nathan, my son-in-law. I almost let it go to voicemail before answering. Nathan? Sorry to call so late. His voice sounded hesitant. Did I wake you? Not even close. He laughed softly. Emily said you and Rebecca had your anniversary dinner tonight. We did. How did it go? The question seemed innocent enough, yet something in his tone felt different. Careful, measured. Fine, I replied. Why do you ask? Silence lingered for a second. Then he said, maybe it is nothing. I just got the feeling Emily was worried about something. My attention sharpened immediately. Worried about what? She did not really say. Another pause. She mentioned that Rebecca has seemed distracted lately. I leaned back in my chair. Did she? Probably nothing. Nathan sounded uncomfortable now. Forget I said anything. We spoke for another minute before ending the call. Yet after hanging up, I remained motionless. Emily had noticed something. Nathan had noticed something. And apparently I was the last person catching up to a story already unfolding around me. The rain outside grew heavier. I walked toward the window and looked across the dark backyard. Water shimmered beneath the security lights. Somewhere upstairs, Rebecca was sleeping peacefully. At least I assumed she was. For the first time, I found myself wondering how much she knew. Not about the box. About everything else. The notebook. Richard Hale. The questions about trusts and accounts. The hidden connections stretching back years. My gaze returned to the photographs lining the study wall. There were pieces of my life there that very few people understood. Decisions I had made. Relationships I had built. Responsibilities I had never fully explained to anyone. Robert was right about one thing. People often mistake quietness for weakness, retirement for irrelevance, age for surrender. And as I stood there listening to the rain, I began to suspect that someone had made exactly that mistake. The frightening part was that they seemed convinced they already knew the outcome, which meant they had no idea how much they still did not know. The next morning arrived gray and quiet. Rain clouds still hung over Austin, turning the sky the color of worn steel. Rebecca was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She stood at the counter pouring coffee into her favorite blue mug. The same mug Emily had given her years ago. For a moment, she looked exactly like the woman I had spent more than 3 decades with. Familiar, comfortable, safe. Good morning, she said without looking up. You were up late. Could not sleep. Neither could I. She finally met my eyes. You seem distracted. I poured my own coffee and sat at the table. Do I? Yes. Her voice remained calm. Is something wrong? It would have been easy to confront her right then. Easy to ask questions. Easy to demand answers. But Robert's voice still echoed in my mind. Understand everything before reacting. So I simply shook my head. Just tired. She studied me for another second before returning to her coffee. The silence between us felt different now. Not hostile, not angry. Just crowded with things neither of us was saying. Later that afternoon, I drove downtown to meet Robert Gaines. His office occupied the second floor of an older brick building near the Colorado River. The place smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. When I entered, a receptionist greeted me warmly. Mr. Mercer? Yes. Mr. Gaines is expecting you. Robert was older than I imagined. Early 70s, perhaps. Tall, straight-backed. The kind of man whose presence filled a room without effort. He crossed the office and extended his hand. Daniel. Robert. His handshake was firm. Familiar somehow. We sat near a large window overlooking the city. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Robert opened a thick folder resting on his desk. I reviewed the material again this morning. My eyes moved toward the folder. And I think you need to prepare yourself. The words settled heavily between us. Robert slid several documents across the desk. Financial transfers, property records, corporate filings. Names repeated throughout the paperwork. Richard Hale appeared again and again. So did several companies I had never heard of. Then another name appeared. Rebecca Mercer. My chest tightened. Not because I was shocked anymore. Because seeing it in black ink made everything harder to dismiss. How long? I asked quietly. Robert removed his glasses. Long enough that it was not accidental. I stared at the documents. Was she involved knowingly? I do not know. His honesty surprised me. That is the truth, Daniel. Some people understand exactly what they are doing. Others convince themselves they are helping. We do not know which category she belongs to yet. I appreciated that answer more than certainty. Real life rarely arrives with complete explanations. What happens now? Robert leaned back. Now you do nothing. I laughed softly. That sounds difficult. Good decisions usually are. He pointed toward the documents. The people behind this believe they are ahead. Let them keep believing that. On my drive home, I thought about those words. Let them keep believing that. For years, I had spent my career negotiating contracts, managing risk, reading situations before making decisions. Yet somewhere inside my marriage, I had stopped paying attention. I had assumed trust required blindness. Maybe that was my mistake. That evening, Rebecca received a phone call during dinner. She glanced at the screen and immediately stood up. I need to take this. Work? I asked. Something like that. She stepped outside onto the back patio. Through the kitchen window, I could see her pacing slowly beneath the covered porch, speaking quickly, looking over her shoulder more than once. When she finally returned, her expression had changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Everything okay? I asked. She forced a smile. Of course. But her coffee remained untouched for the rest of the evening. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed. A message from Robert. One sentence. She is moving faster than expected. Call me. I stepped into my study and dialed immediately. Robert answered on the first ring. What happened? I asked. Richard is nervous. How do you know? Because nervous people make mistakes. I sat down slowly. What kind of mistakes? The kind that leave records. There was a pause. Then Robert continued. 3 separate calls were made this afternoon. One to a financial advisor, one to a property attorney, one to a trust consultant. My pulse quickened. Can they do anything? Not without your approval. Then why are they trying? Robert's answer came quietly. Because they do not know what they do not know. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not fear. Clarity. The board was finally visible. The pieces were finally moving into place. And the people who believed they controlled the game were beginning to panic. Over the next few days, the pattern became impossible to miss. Rebecca grew more distracted, more impatient. Questions appeared suddenly. Casual questions. Innocent questions. Have you reviewed the trust recently? She asked one morning. Not lately. Maybe you should. Another day she asked, do you ever think about simplifying things for Emily? I looked up from my newspaper. What things? The estate. The paperwork. All of it. I smiled politely. Why the sudden interest? For the briefest moment, something flashed across her face. Then it vanished. Just trying to be practical. Practical. The word lingered in the room long after she left. Later that night, I stood alone on the back porch watching the lights shimmer across the wet grass. Inside the house, Rebecca moved from room to room speaking softly on her phone. I could not hear the words, only the tension behind them. Somewhere out there, Richard Hale was scrambling. Somewhere out there, explanations were being rehearsed and stories were being prepared. But the strange thing was this. I no longer felt the need to fight anyone. I did not need revenge. I did not need shouting. I did not need dramatic confrontations. The truth was already doing the work. All I had to do was stop looking away from it. And for the first time in a very long time, the people who thought they held all the answers were beginning to realize they might have misunderstood the man sitting quietly across the table from them. 3 days later, everything began falling apart. And the remarkable thing was that I barely touched the first domino. The collapse started on a Thursday morning. I was sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee watching a pair of cardinals hop across the wet grass when my phone rang. It was Robert. His voice sounded calmer than usual. That alone told me something significant had happened. You should probably sit down, he said. I looked at my coffee and smiled faintly. I already am. Good. Richard Hale has a problem. I waited. One of his business partners just resigned. That got my attention. Why? Because they discovered discrepancies. I leaned back in my chair. The same discrepancies? Some of them. A breeze moved through the oak trees above me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Robert added, people stay loyal when they think a ship is sailing. They become much less loyal when they realize it might be sinking. After the call ended, I sat quietly staring across the yard. Years ago, during my business career, I learned something about difficult situations. Most collapses do not happen because of one dramatic event. They happen because pressure reveals existing cracks. Once people become afraid, they stop protecting each other. They start protecting themselves. That afternoon, Rebecca received another phone call. I noticed it immediately because she stepped outside before answering. 20 minutes later, she came back inside looking pale. Everything okay? I asked. Fine. The answer came too quickly. You do not look fine. She forced a smile. Just a headache. But she barely touched her dinner that night. Around 8 o'clock, I heard her voice drifting from the study while she spoke on the phone. The door was mostly closed. I could not hear every word. Only fragments. That is not what you told me. Silence. Well, what are we supposed to do now? Another pause. Then a sentence that stayed with me. You promised this would never happen. The call ended a few minutes later. When Rebecca emerged, she seemed startled to find me sitting in the living room. How long have you been here? She asked. Long enough to finish a baseball game. She laughed nervously. You scared me. I said nothing. Sometimes silence tells people more than questions ever could. The next morning brought another development. Nathan called unexpectedly. Do you have a minute? He asked. Of course. He hesitated. I think something strange is going on. My grip tightened slightly around the phone. What kind of strange? Emily had lunch with your wife yesterday. I listened carefully. And? Apparently they argued. That surprised me. Rebecca and Emily rarely argued. About what? Money? Nathan sounded uncomfortable. Emily would not tell me everything, but she seemed upset. I walked slowly toward the kitchen window. What exactly did she say? She said your wife kept pushing her to support some financial changes involving family assets. My pulse slowed instead of quickened. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were aligning. How did Emily respond? Nathan sighed. Not well. Later that evening, Emily called me herself. Dad? Her voice sounded troubled. Everything okay? That depends. She paused. Can I ask you something? Anything? Have you been planning to change anything involving the trust? I stared through the darkening window. Why would you ask that? Another pause. Mom keeps bringing it up. There it was. Not an accusation, not a revelation. Just a daughter confused by something that no longer made sense. No, I said gently. I have not been planning any changes. Emily exhaled slowly. That is what I thought. After we ended the call, I sat alone in my study for nearly an hour. Across the room hung an old photograph of me and Emily standing beside the fishing boat from years ago. She was smiling, missing one front tooth, holding a fish she could barely lift. Looking at that picture hurt in a different way. Whatever happened next would not only affect a marriage, it would affect a family. Meanwhile, the situation around Richard continued to deteriorate. Robert updated me almost daily. Another investor withdrew. A consultant resigned. Questions multiplied. Explanations became harder to maintain. The most revealing part was what happened between Richard and the people closest to him. According to Robert, several conversations had become heated. Former allies were suddenly protecting themselves. Everybody is blaming everybody else, Robert told me during one call. Nobody wants ownership. I shook my head. That usually means they know there is a problem. Exactly. Then came the moment that changed everything. 2 days later, Rebecca received a call while we were having breakfast. She answered immediately. What do you mean? He backed out. Her voice rose before she could stop it. She stood and walked toward the hallway. No, that is not acceptable. A pause. Then tell Richard to fix it. Silence. Then another sentence. Do not put this on me. The call ended abruptly. She stood motionless for several seconds before turning around. The expression on her face was not confidence anymore. It was fear. Real fear. For the first time since this story began, I realized something important. Rebecca and Richard were no longer standing together. The pressure was pushing them apart. The promises were breaking. The trust was evaporating. Each was beginning to see the other as a liability instead of an ally. And I had not exposed them. I had not confronted them. I had not demanded anything. The truth had simply entered the room. Once it did, everyone started revealing who they really were. That night, as I prepared for bed, my phone vibrated with a message from Robert. Just one sentence. Richard Hale is looking for someone to blame. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I placed the phone on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. Because after years of hidden conversations, secret plans, and carefully managed appearances, the people who thought they were controlling the story were finally losing control of each other. The strangest part of healing is that it rarely begins when the problem ends. It begins when you finally stop chasing answers that can no longer change the outcome. A week after Robert sent me that message, I found myself sitting alone on the dock behind a friend's lake house outside Marble Falls. The water was calm that morning. A light mist hovered above the surface. Somewhere across the lake, a fishing boat moved slowly through the fog. For the first time in months, maybe years, nobody needed anything from me. Nobody was asking questions. Nobody was trying to convince me of anything. The silence felt unfamiliar. Then it began to feel like a gift. My phone buzzed beside me. A message from Emily. "Good morning, Dad. Are you free for lunch tomorrow?" I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Not because I needed to check my schedule, because that simple message meant more than she probably realized. During difficult times, people often discover who is running toward them and who is running away. I typed back, "Absolutely. Looking forward to it." A few minutes later, another message arrived. "Love you." I closed my eyes for a moment. Some victories never appear in courtrooms or financial statements. Some arrive as 12 simple letters on a phone screen. The following afternoon, I met Emily and Nathan at a small restaurant near downtown Austin. Nothing fancy, just a place that served good barbecue and sweet tea. When I arrived, Nathan stood and shook my hand. Emily hugged me. Neither gesture felt forced. We ordered lunch, talked about ordinary things, traffic, work, the Texas heat, baseball. For nearly 30 minutes, nobody mentioned the storm that had swept through our lives. Then Emily finally looked down at her iced tea. "Dad?" "Yes?" "I owe you an apology." I waited. "For what?" Her eyes filled slightly. "For not seeing things sooner." I leaned back in my chair. "Emily, you are not responsible for choices other people make." "Maybe not." She smiled sadly. "But I should have paid more attention." Nathan nodded quietly beside her. I looked at both of them and realized something important. They were hurting too. Sometimes when betrayal enters a family, everyone carries a different version of the wound. "You know what your grandfather used to tell me?" I asked. Emily shook her head. "He said that when people are lost, they usually need a light more than they need a lecture." She smiled through her tears. "That sounds like Grandpa." We laughed softly. The conversation shifted after that. Lighter. Easier. By the time lunch ended, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Hope. Not hope that the past could be repaired. Hope that the future could still be meaningful. A few days later, I drove back to the house and began sorting through old boxes stored in the garage. Photographs, letters, fishing gear, holiday decorations. The kind of things people accumulate over a lifetime. At the bottom of one box, I found the old Alaska travel folder Rebecca and I had once used to plan our dream trip. The edges were worn. Several pages had yellowed with age. Years earlier, finding it would have filled me with sadness. This time it felt different. I sat on a folding chair and slowly turned the pages. Glacier tours, railroad routes, national parks, dreams from another chapter of life. Then I smiled. Because I realized something. Just because one dream disappears does not mean life runs out of new ones. Later that week, I received another call from Robert. "How are you doing?" he asked. It was the first time he had asked me that question. Not about documents, not about investigations, about me. Better than I expected. Good. We spoke for several minutes. Before ending the call, he said something I never forgot. Most people think strength comes from holding on. And sometimes strength comes from knowing what to release. After hanging up, I sat quietly in my study. The rain had finally stopped. Sunlight streamed through the window. Dust floated through the air like tiny golden sparks. My eyes settled on the photographs lining the shelves. Not the awards, not the certificates. The family pictures, birthday cakes, fishing trips, Christmas mornings. Those images represented the real wealth of a life. Not accounts, not property, not investments. Relationships, memories, time. The things nobody can transfer, manipulate, or steal. That evening, Nathan stopped by unexpectedly. He carried a tackle box under one arm. "Any interest in fishing Saturday?" he asked. I smiled. "You asking because you need advice?" "Absolutely." "Then yes." He laughed. We spent the next hour sitting on the back porch talking about boats, weather, and terrible fishing decisions. Ordinary conversation. Honest conversation. The kind that becomes increasingly valuable with age. After he left, I remained outside watching the sunset fade beyond the trees. The sky turned orange, then purple, then deep blue. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime stirred gently in the evening breeze. For the first time since all of this began, I was no longer thinking about Richard, or secrets, or hidden agendas. I was thinking about what remained: family that still cared, friends who stayed, values that survived, a life that was still mine. And as darkness settled across the yard, I realized the greatest gift was never the exposure of a lie. It was the opportunity to rediscover everything that had been true all along. 6 months later, the house felt different. Not because the furniture had changed, not because the walls looked different. The change was quieter than that. It lived in the absence of tension. It lived in the absence of waiting for the next disappointment. It lived in the simple fact that when I woke up each morning, I no longer felt like a guest inside my own life. The legal matters eventually resolved themselves the way most real-world problems do. Slowly, patiently, without dramatic speeches or cinematic endings. Richard Hale lost far more than money. Investors stopped returning his calls. Business relationships dissolved. Partnerships disappeared. People who once praised him publicly suddenly preferred distance. Not because anyone destroyed him. Because trust, once broken, rarely grows back in the same shape. Rebecca faced her own consequences. The future she thought she was moving toward never arrived. Promises made by people with hidden motives rarely survive pressure. We spoke only a handful of times during those months. There was no shouting, no bitterness, just the quiet recognition that some choices permanently changed the road ahead. One afternoon, she looked at me across a conference table and said, "I never thought it would end like this." I nodded slowly. Neither did I. For a moment, I saw something I had not seen in a long time. Not manipulation, not defensiveness. Regret. Real regret. It did not erase what happened. It did not repair the damage. But it reminded me that human beings are often more complicated than heroes and villains. We ended our conversation with a handshake. Nothing more. Nothing less. Afterward, I walked outside into the Texas sunlight and realized I felt lighter than I had in years. Meanwhile, life kept moving. Emily and Nathan became a larger part of my world. We started having Sunday dinners together, sometimes at their house, sometimes at mine, sometimes at little restaurants where nobody cared who anyone used to be. One evening, Nathan stood beside me while we grilled burgers in the backyard. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. "Sure." He smiled. "I always respected you." I laughed softly. "That sounds like the beginning of a compliment and an insult at the same time." He laughed too. "What I mean is, I thought strength looked different when I was younger." "Different how?" "Louder." We stood quietly for a moment, watching the sunset turn the clouds orange. Then he added, "Turns out real strength is staying calm when everybody else loses theirs." I never forgot that. Emily changed too. The confusion she carried gradually gave way to confidence. One afternoon, she sat across from me on the back porch, holding a cup of coffee. "You know what I learned?" she asked. "What?" She smiled sadly. "That loving someone does not mean ignoring what is right in front of you." I nodded. "That is a hard lesson. Maybe one of the hardest." The truth was that all of us had changed. Not because of a single event. Because difficult seasons force people to decide who they want to become afterward. As for me, I stopped measuring life by achievements. The awards on my wall mattered less. The financial statements mattered less. The titles mattered less. What mattered was waking up with peace. What mattered was being surrounded by people whose presence did not require performance. What mattered was knowing I could trust my own instincts again. About a year after everything began, I finally took a trip to Alaska. Not because it had been part of an old dream, because I wanted to create a new one. Emily insisted on coming. Nathan joined us. We spent 8 days exploring mountains, forests, and glaciers I had only seen in brochures decades earlier. One evening we stood together overlooking a valley bathed in golden sunlight. Emily slipped her arm through mine and said, "Mom would have loved this view." I looked across the horizon and smiled gently. Yes, I think she would have. The statement surprised even me. But healing does not always mean forgetting. Sometimes it means remembering without carrying the weight anymore. On our final night in Alaska, I sat alone outside the lodge long after everyone else had gone inside. The air was cool. The sky seemed endless. I thought about Tyler, about Robert, about Thomas Brooks, about all the people whose decisions had altered the direction of my life. I thought about how close I came to spending the rest of my years trapped inside a story built on half-truths and assumptions. Most of all, I thought about that small black box. After returning home, I placed it on a shelf inside my study, not as a reminder of betrayal, as a reminder of awakening. Sometimes visitors ask about it. I usually smile and say, "It contains one of the most important lessons I ever learned." They always ask what lesson. I always give the same answer. The truth does not arrive to destroy your life. It arrives to give you a chance to live it honestly. If you are listening to my story and carrying a disappointment of your own, I hope you remember something. You do not have to let another person's choices define your value. You do not have to surrender your peace to someone else's deception. Protect your heart. Protect your judgment. Protect the life you are building. And when your instincts whisper that something is wrong, listen, not with fear, with wisdom. Because self-respect is not selfish. Boundaries are not cruelty. Independence is not loneliness. Sometimes the most important person you need to stop abandoning is yourself. If this story stayed with you, if some part of it felt familiar, I hope you will take a moment to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. I always enjoy reading where people are listening from and what lessons they carried away with them. The core lesson of this story is simple. Never allow anyone else to define your worth. Before I go, thank you for spending part of your day with me. Stories connect people who may never meet, yet somehow understand each other completely. If you have ever felt overlooked, betrayed, or uncertain about your own path, I hope this journey reminded you that peace is still possible. As I finish telling this story, the black box still sits on the shelf behind my desk. It no longer feels heavy. It no longer feels mysterious. In the evening sunlight, it simply rests there beside an old Alaska photograph and the watch I wore for 34 years. 3 objects, 3 chapters, 3 reminders that sometimes losing an illusion is the first step toward finding yourself. And the older I get, the more I believe this truth. The people who matter most will never ask you to become smaller so they can feel bigger.